In life, we all hope to find the perfect partner, someone who makes us feel cherished and understood. But what happens when the person you trust the most in the world, your child, unravels the truth about the person you were about to marry? For David Matthews, this was the reality on what should have been the happiest day of his life. A day that, instead of celebrating love, became the moment his son Max stopped his wedding and uncovered a devastating secret that would change their lives forever. The courage of a child, unveiling hidden truths. The courage of a child is a quiet, powerful force that can change the course of lives. It is a raw, untainted kind of bravery, unclouded by the doubts or limitations that often plague adults. In the case of young Max Matthews, it was this exact courage born from love and the desperate need to protect his father that propelled him to take a stand at the most critical moment. What started as a seemingly innocent feeling of discomfort, a simple suspicion of someone who seemed too good to be true, transformed into a revelation that would unearth a shocking truth about his father's fiancée, Grace. Max had always been an observant child. Even at the tender age of 10, he had a maturity about him that often surprised the adults around him. This was a boy who could read a room with a glance, sensing the tension that lurked just beneath the surface of everyday conversations. His father David had raised him alone after the passing of his mother, and the two had developed a strong, unbreakable bond. It was a connection formed through years of shared laughter, struggles, and the quiet understanding that they were each other's world. Max had learned from his father that the most important thing in life was love, and that love demanded truth, honesty, and unwavering loyalty. When Grace entered their lives, David was overjoyed. For the first time in years, he seemed to be smiling again. His laughter filled the house, and the possibility of a new family seemed like the best thing that could have happened. But to Max, it felt different. It was as if the light in his father's eyes, which had once been a reflection of genuine happiness, had been replaced with a kind of blinded optimism. Max could see it the way Grace's sweetness to his father was shadowed by something colder when David wasn't around. The subtle dismissals, the harsh remarks, the way she seemed to exclude him when his father wasn't looking. Max's gut told him that something was off, but as a child, he struggled to find the words to explain his discomfort. Max was never one to voice his suspicions outright. Instead, he tried to stay quiet, unsure whether anyone would believe him if he did speak up. He watched as his father's love for Grace grew, and he saw how happy it made David. But inside, Max's heart grew heavy with the knowledge that his father was blind to the truth. The dissonance between his father's joy and the reality he saw made him feel like an outsider in his own home. Yet Max couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. It wasn't until days before the wedding that Max overheard something that would shatter the illusion he had tried to hold on to. He had been playing in his room when he heard Grace speaking on the phone. At first, he didn't think much of it, until he realized the conversation was not just a casual chat about wedding details or plans for their life together. Instead, it was about money, insurance, and something much darker. Max's breath caught in his throat as he heard Grace's voice cold, calculating as she spoke to someone named Mark. The words he overheard were chilling. "Once we're married, we'll move on to phase 2, Grace said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The insurance policy is ironclad. A tragic accident, and we're set for life." Max's stomach twisted in knots. The gravity of what he was hearing settled over him like a thick fog. His mind raced. What was she talking about? Was she planning to hurt his father? Max couldn't make sense of it all, but one thing was crystal clear. Grace was not the woman his father thought she was. Max's heart raced as he realized the danger his father was in. There was no time to waste. He had to do something, but fear gripped him. How could he stop a wedding, especially when his own father was so enamored by this woman? Would David believe him? Would anyone? Max had always been the quiet, obedient Sonhao. Could he be expected to speak up against someone so much older, so much more powerful, so much more convincing than he was? But Max was no ordinary child. He had inherited his mother's fierce determination, and he knew one thing. The man he loved more than anyone else in the world, his father, was in danger. Max couldn't let that happen, not without doing everything in his power to stop it. His father had always taught him that right and wrong weren't always clear-cut, that sometimes you had to make the hard choice, even if it meant standing alone. It was a lesson Max had carried with him every day, and now it was time for him to apply it. He didn't fully understand the depths of the conspiracy Grace was planning, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let his father marry her. The night before the wedding, Max lay awake in his bed, his thoughts racing. The weight of the secret pressed down on him, threatening to crush him under its enormity. But as the minutes ticked by, Max felt something else stir within him, a quiet sense of resolve. He couldn't go to sleep until he had done something. He had to protect his father no matter what the cost. The morning of the wedding was a blur. David, excited and nervous in equal measure, went about preparing for the ceremony. He was practically glowing as he fixed his tuxedo, looking forward to marrying the woman he believed was the one for him. Max, however, could barely breathe. Every second felt like an eternity as the wedding preparations continued around him. He wanted to shout the truth, to warn his father, but his voice was caught in his throat. How could he possibly stop this wedding? How could he reveal the secrets he had uncovered? As the ceremony began and the guests took their places, Max stood beside his father, his heart racing. David smiled at him, ruffling his hair. "You look great, buddy," he said. Max forced a smile, but inside he was shaking. When Grace appeared at the end of the aisle, radiant in her wedding gown, David's eyes filled with admiration and love. The moment seemed perfect, but Max knew that perfection was a lie. When the officiant began the ceremony, Max could no longer stay silent. The words of the ceremony were a blur to him, his mind consumed with the urgency of the moment. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, and before he could stop it, the words burst from his mouth. "Stop the wedding!" Max shouted. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. David, confused and concerned, turned to his son. "Max, what's wrong, buddy?" he asked, his voice full of worry. Max's courage, though trembling, did not falter. "Dad, you can't marry her. She's not who you think she is." In that moment, Max did what many adults are too afraid to do, spoke the truth, no matter the consequences. And though his small voice trembled with fear, it carried with it the weight of undeniable honesty. It was a revelation that would change everything for his family. Max's courage didn't come from an absence of fear, but from his unwavering desire to protect the one person who had always been there for him, his father. Even though he was just a child, Max knew the power of truth. And in that moment, as his father knelt before him, listening with shock and disbelief, Max realized that sometimes even the smallest voice can make the biggest difference. Through the courage of a child, the truth was exposed, and a father was given the chance to choose love and safety over deceit. Max Matthews may have been small, but his bravery in the face of a devastating secret proved that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that speaks out against what is wronggiven when the world feels too big and the stakes too high. It was a lesson in courage, in truth, and in the unbreakable bond between a father and son. And as the ceremony came to a halt, with the truth laid bare for all to see, Max realized something profound sometimes. Standing up for what is right is the most powerful thing a person, no matter their age, can do. The moment of truth, a son's bravery, a father's heartbreak. The moment of truth is often the hardest to face, especially when it shatters everything we thought we knew and forces us to confront the reality we've been avoiding. For young Ethan Matthews, that moment came on what should have been the happiest day of his father's life, the day his father was about to marry, the woman he had come to believe was the one. But for Ethan, the day was a culmination of months of growing unease, a simmering sense of dread that he could no longer ignore. It was a day where his bravery would collide with his father's heart, forcing the truth into the light. Ethan, at just 10 years old, was an old soul in many ways. Raised by his father David since the passing of his mother, Ethan had developed a deep sense of loyalty and a natural instinct to protect those he loved. He had always been his father's confidant, the boy who could tell when David was genuinely happy and when he was merely pretending. And while David had been filled with joy and excitement about his upcoming wedding, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. From the moment his father introduced Grace, the woman he was about to marry, Ethan had sensed a disquiet he couldn't quite explain. Grace was beautiful, charming, and seemingly perfect in every way. But as the weeks went by, Ethan began to notice cracks in the facade. It wasn't that Grace was overtly cruel or openly dismissive, at least. Not in front of David. When they were alone, however, Ethan could feel the coldness behind her smile, the distance in her voice when she spoke to him. There were moments of tension, fleeting but sharp, when Grace would snap at him over the smallest of things. She would call him a burden when David wasn't around, belittle his attempts at conversation, and make him feel like an intruder in his own home. These subtle acts of cruelty built up over time, leaving Ethan with an overwhelming sense of isolation and confusion. Why would his father not see what was so painfully clear to him? The truth was, Ethan loved his father deeply, and he didn't want to ruin his happiness. David was finally smiling again, after years of pain and solitude. And the thought of his father losing that joy of his father being hurt was a weight Ethan couldn't bear. But the more he observed Grace's behavior, the more he felt that the truth could not remain hidden, no matter how much it hurt. He had to find a way to expose her, to protect his father, even if it meant breaking his heart. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of excitement and tension. While David busied himself with wedding plans, convinced that everything was perfect, Ethan spent every waking moment consumed with worry. His suspicions about Grace had grown into something far darker when he overheard a conversation that would change everything. Late one night, after David had gone to bed, Ethan had been unable to sleep. He quietly tiptoed down the hallway for a glass of water, only to pause when he heard Grace speaking on the phone in the living room. What he overheard in that conversation was a nightmare come to life plans, not for a wedding, but for something far more sinister. "I've got everything set." Grace's voice was low, almost too calm. "Once we're married, we'll move on to phase 2. The policy's ironclad. A tragic accident, and we're set for life." Ethan's heart sank into his stomach as he realized what she was talking about. Insurance, money, death. The woman his father loved was planning to kill him for the insurance payout. And the worst part? She was doing it with someone named Mark, who Ethan had never met, but whose presence was now as ominous as it was undeniable. Grace wasn't just cold to him, she was planning his father's demise. Ethan's mind raced as he processed what he had just heard. This couldn't be happening. He couldn't be hearing this. But he was, and he couldn't turn a blind eye. His father, the man who had raised him, who had done everything for him, was in immediate danger. The boy who had always been taught to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost, could no longer remain silent. But what could a 10-year-old do against an adult who was so cunning, so cold, and so determined? Ethan spent the next few days in a state of paralyzing fear. How could he stop the wedding? Would his father believe him? Would anyone? And if they didn't, what would happen to him? What would happen to his father? The thought of losing his father, of not being able to protect him, was unbearable. Ethan had always trusted his father, but now, in this terrible moment, he was unsure if his father's love for Grace had blinded him to the truth. The man who had always been his protector was now in danger, and Ethan was alone in trying to save him. The day of the wedding arrived with all its usual excitement and anticipation. David was positively glowing as he prepared for the ceremony, and though Ethan tried to muster a smile, the knot in his stomach grew tighter with each passing minute. The weight of the secret he carried threatened to suffocate him. Every moment felt like an eternity. Every word spoken in the ceremony seemed meaningless as he stood there, watching his father prepare to marry a woman who was not who she seemed. And then, as Grace walked down the aisle, beautiful and radiant, Ethan knew he had no choice but to act. The fear that had consumed him up until that point gave way to something stronger, a fierce need to protect the person he loved most in the world. When the officiant asked if anyone had just cause to stop the wedding, the words came out before Ethan could think. "Stop the wedding!" he shouted, his small voice echoing through the chapel. The room fell silent in an instant, all eyes turning to him. David, his face a picture of confusion and concern, turned toward his son, his face full of worry. "Ethan, what's wrong, buddy?" he asked. In that moment, Ethan knew what he had to do. He had to speak the truth, no matter how it might hurt. "Dad, you can't marry her." Ethan's voice trembled, but he pressed on. "She's not who you think she is." The words were sharp, painful to say, but they were the only words that mattered. David knelt before his son, his face full of concern, but Ethan could see the doubt in his father's eyes. "What do you mean, son?" David asked gently. Ethan's heart pounded as he struggled to find the right words, the ones that would make David understand. "She's been lying to you, Dad. She's planning something bad. I overheard her talking to someone named Mark. She has an insurance policy, and they're going to hurt you after the wedding." The silence in the room was deafening. Grace, who had been standing next to David just moments before, let out a nervous laugh, clearly trying to brush off the accusation. But her eyes flickered with a momentary flicker of panic. "Ethan, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I know this is a big change for you. It's okay to feel scared about having a new mom, but this is not how you should express it." Ethan wasn't backing down. "No, it's true," he insisted. "I saw the insurance policy on Dad's computer. I saw pictures of you and Mark. You're not just his wedding planner. You're planning to hurt him. You want to kill him for the money." David's face paled as he listened to his son. The color drained from his cheeks, and for a moment it seemed like the world had stopped spinning. The woman he was about to marry, the woman he had entrusted with his heart, had been lying to him all along. Ethan's words had struck at the very core of David's world, and in that moment, everything he thought he knew was torn apart. David turned to Grace, his voice low but steady. "Is this true?" he asked, the pain in his voice unmistakable. Grace's face crumbled in front of him. Her composure, the mask of warmth and charm she had worn for so long, shattered in an instant. The truth was too much for her to deny. The woman who had appeared so perfect was nothing more than a skilled manipulator, willing to go to any length to get what she wanted. And in that moment, David realized something profound. His son had been right all along. Ethan had seen through the illusion, had recognized the danger even when David couldn't, and had found the courage to speak up. As David's heart broke, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the child who had saved his life, who had protected him in a way that no one else could. Ethan wasn't just his son, he was his hero. The heartbreak David felt was unimaginable, but it was also a reminder of the unbreakable bond between father and son. A son's bravery had revealed the truth, saving his father from a woman who never truly cared for him. And though the pain would linger, the love between them would only grow stronger, because in the face of a devastating truth, they had each other, and that was all that mattered. The shock and aftermath. A father's betrayal and panic. The weight of betrayal is not something easily carried, especially when it comes from someone you trusted, someone you believed would stand beside you for the rest of your life. For David Matthews, the moment his son Ethan revealed the horrifying truth about his fiancée, the world as he knew it shattered. One moment, he was standing at the altar, ready to say his vows, filled with joy and hope for the future. The next, he was drowning in a storm of disbelief, humiliation, and panic, struggling to comprehend how everything he had built with Grace was nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion. The silence that followed Ethan's accusation was suffocating. The murmurs of wedding guests blurred into white noise as David turned to Grace, searching her face for something that could prove his son wrong. He wanted to see shock in her eyes, hurt that she would be accused of something so vile. But instead, he saw something else entirely. Panic. Not the kind of panic that comes from being falsely accused, but the kind that comes from being caught. Her perfect mask cracked in that instant, just enough for him to see what had been hiding beneath it all along. David felt his breath catch in his throat. His heart, which had been so full just moments before, now felt as though it were being squeezed by an invisible force. His hands trembled as he stepped away from Grace, his mind racing to make sense of what he had just heard. "Tell me this isn't true," he pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me my son is lying." But Grace didn't answer right away. Her hesitation, the flicker of calculation in her eyes, was all the confirmation he needed. Ethan, standing small but unshaken in front of the sea of shocked wedding guests, took a deep breath and continued. "I heard you, Grace, late at night. You were on the phone with someone named Mark, talking about how, after the wedding, there would be an accident. How Dad wouldn't see it coming. I saw the insurance policy on your computer. It's for millions of dollars, but only if something happens to him." His voice was steady, but there was a quiet desperation in his words. He wasn't just exposing a lie, he was fighting to save his father's life. David's legs felt weak beneath him. He turned to Grace once more, his mind unwilling to let go of the woman he had loved. "Who is Mark?" he demanded, his voice breaking. Grace opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The moment stretched unbearably long, the weight of the truth pressing down on them all. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, colder, sharper, as though the effort of pretending had become too exhausting. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed, shaking her head. "David, think about what's happening right now. Your son is trying to ruin our wedding because he can't handle change. He's making up stories because he doesn't want me in his life." But David wasn't listening to her anymore. His mind was replaying every moment of their relationship. Every time Ethan had seemed uncomfortable around Grace. Every time he had dismissed his son's concerns as mere childish resistance. How many signs had he missed? How many times had he overlooked something that now seemed glaringly obvious? He felt sick. The realization that he had been living in a carefully constructed fantasy was like a blow to the chest. He had been so eager to move forward, to find happiness again, that he had ignored the one person who had always stood by him as son. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, shifting from whispers of curiosity to murmurs of concern. People were beginning to put the pieces together, to see the raw betrayal unfolding in front of them. Jack, David's best man, stepped forward hesitantly. "Dave, man, maybe we should step outside, talk this through." But David shook his head, his eyes never leaving Grace. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "You lied to me," David said, his voice now steady, filled with a quiet rage that sent chills through the air. "Everything was it all a lie? Were you ever going to tell me the truth, or was I just another name on your list?" Grace's carefully controlled expression faltered for just a second, but that was all it took. David saw it, the guilt, the frustration, the anger at having been exposed, and then she ran. The moment Grace bolted for the exit, the entire church erupted into chaos. Gasps filled the air, and a few guests tried to stop her, but she was too fast, her dress billowing behind her as she pushed through the doors and into the sunlight. David stood frozen for a split second before instinct took over. He turned to Jack. "Call the police," he ordered, his voice sharp. Jack, still reeling from the sudden turn of events, nodded and pulled out his phone. David sprinted after Grace, his heart hammering in his chest. He could hear Ethan calling out behind him, but all he could focus on was the woman who had nearly ruined his life, the woman who had nearly cost him everything. He reached the parking lot just in time to see Grace fumbling with her car keys, her hands shaking as she tried to unlock the door. "Grace, stop!" he shouted. She spun around, her face wild with desperation. "David, listen to me," she pleaded. "This isn't what you think. I can explain." But David had heard enough lies for a lifetime. "Explain what?" He shot back. "That you were planning to kill me? That I was nothing more than a paycheck to you?" His voice cracked, the betrayal cutting deeper than he thought possible. "You were going to take me away from my son." Grace's eyes darted around, looking for a way out. But before she could make a move, the distant wail of sirens filled the air. The police were coming. She turned back to David, her expression shifting from desperation to something else, resignation. "You should have just gone along with it," she muttered. "Would have been easier for everyone." The words sent a shiver through David's spine. There was no remorse, no regret, only the bitterness of a plan gone wrong. Before he could respond, flashing red and blue lights flooded the parking lot, and within moments, officers were surrounding them. One officer stepped forward. "Miss, put your hands where we can see them." Grace exhaled sharply, then slowly raised her hands. David felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he watched the woman he had once loved be handcuffed and led toward the waiting police car. It was over. But the damage she had done, the trust she had shattered, would take far longer to repair. As the officers finished questioning David, he finally turned to see Ethan standing near the church entrance, watching everything unfold with wide, unblinking eyes. David's heart clenched. His son, the one person who had seen the truth from the start, the one who had tried to warn him, had just saved his life. David walked over, dropping to his knees so he was at Ethan's level. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have listened to you." Ethan, still shaken, threw his arms around his father. "I was scared, Dad," he admitted, his voice muffled against David's shoulder. "I didn't want to lose you." David held his son tightly, vowing in that moment that he would never let anything come between them again. "You won't," he promised. "Not ever." The wedding day that had started with excitement and joy had ended in betrayal and heartbreak. But in that moment, as father and son held on to each other, David realized that he had lost nothing of real value. He had his son, and that was all he needed. Rebuilding trust. A father's deepest regret, a son's unwavering love. The quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the kitchen clock were the only sounds in the Matthews household that night. David sat at the dining table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across from him, Ethan sat with his knees pulled up to his chest, staring at nothing in particular. The silence between them was heavy, filled with things that needed to be said, but hadn't yet found the right words. It had been 2 weeks since the wedding that never was, since the moment Ethan had stood up in front of an entire church and saved his father from the greatest mistake of his life. And yet, despite everything, David still found it hard to meet his son's eyes. The guilt was unbearable, not just because he had been fooled by Grace, not just because he had almost lost everything, but because he had ignored Ethan when it mattered most. His son had tried to warn him, had come to him, hesitant but hopeful, with the truth, and David had brushed it off as childish jealousy, as resistance to change. And now, the knowledge that his own blindness had forced his 8-year-old to bear that weight alone crushed him more than anything else. He wanted to fix it, to rebuild what had been broken, but he didn't know where to begin. Ethan shifted in his chair, breaking the silence. "Dad," he said quietly, his voice unsure, "are you okay?" David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Of course, it was Ethan asking if he was okay, not the other way around. His son had always had a heart too big for his small frame. But it was David's turn to be strong now. He set down his coffee and finally met Ethan's gaze. "I should be asking you that, buddy," he admitted. "You've been through so much, and I should have been there for you." Ethan blinked, his small hands gripping the fabric of his pajama pants. "I didn't know if you would believe me," he confessed. "And I didn't want to make you sad." David's throat tightened. The idea that his own son had been afraid to speak his truth because he didn't want to hurt him was almost too much to bear. He reached across the table, resting a hand on Ethan's. "Ethan," he said, his voice raw with emotion, "it's not your job to protect me. It's mine to protect you. And I failed. I should have listened. I should have seen what was happening. And for that, I am so sorry." Ethan looked down at their hands for a moment before whispering, "I was really scared, Dad." David's grip on his son's hand tightened slightly, his own heart aching at the thought of Ethan carrying that fear alone. "I know, buddy," he murmured. "I know. And you were so brave. Braver than I ever was. You saved me." He swallowed hard, then forced himself to say the words that had been weighing on him for days. "But I don't ever want you to feel like you have to handle something like that on your own again. If something is wrong, if you're ever scared, you come to me, no matter what. Because nothing's more important to me than you." Ethan finally looked up at him fully, searching his father's face as if trying to see if he really meant it. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said softly. David exhaled, feeling some of the tension ease, but he knew this conversation was only the beginning. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, and while Ethan had forgiven him easily, that didn't mean David forgave himself. So he made a promise to himself that neither would show Ethan every single day how much he mattered, how much he was loved, and how nothing would ever come before him again. In the days that followed, David took small but deliberate steps to heal the wounds between them. He started by being present, truly present. Instead of letting work consume him, instead of being lost in his own grief over what had happened, he focused on Ethan. They had movie nights on the couch with blankets and popcorn. They played board games that ended in laughter and dramatic accusations of cheating, and David made sure to tuck Ethan in every night, staying just a little longer to talk about his day. It was in those quiet moments, in the spaces between the words, that he could see his son slowly start to relax again. One afternoon, David surprised Ethan by picking him up early from school. "We're going on an adventure," he announced as Ethan climbed into the car, confused but intrigued. "Where?" Ethan asked, buckling his seatbelt. "You'll see." They drove for almost an hour, out of the city and toward a lake David used to visit as a child. It was a place his own father had taken him, a place where life had always felt simpler, freer. When they arrived, Ethan's eyes widened at the sight of the crystal clear water stretching before them. "Whoa," he breathed. David grinned. "Come on, let's go." They spent the afternoon skipping stones, walking along the shore, and really talking. Not just about what had happened, but about everything. Ethan told him about his favorite book series, about the science project he was excited to start, about how he wanted to learn how to fish because what if we ever get stuck on a deserted island? David laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in weeks. "Then I guess I'd better teach you," he said. That evening, as they sat by the water watching the sun set in shades of gold and pink, David felt something settle inside him, a peace he hadn't known he needed. He looked over at Ethan, who was poking at the sand with a stick, and smiled. "I love you, kiddo," he said suddenly. Ethan looked up, surprised, then grinned. "I love you too, Dad." And in that moment, David knew this was what mattered. Not the betrayal, not the hurt, not the what-ifs or the regrets. Just this, just them. As the weeks turned into months, the scars of what had happened didn't disappear, but they became part of their story, one that didn't define them, but reminded them of what they had overcome. David made sure that Ethan knew, without a doubt, that his voice mattered. And Ethan, in turn, grew stronger, more confident, knowing that his father would listen no matter what. One night, as David was tucking Ethan into bed, Ethan hesitated before speaking. "Dad?" he asked. "Yeah, buddy?" Ethan bit his lip, then said, "I'm really glad it's just us again." David felt his chest tighten, but this time, it wasn't with regret, it was with gratitude. He smoothed Ethan's hair back and smiled. "Me too, buddy. Me too." And as he turned off the light and closed the door, David realized that despite everything, they were going to be okay. Not just okay, they were going to be better. Because love, the real kind, didn't come with conditions or betrayals. It was simple, it was steady, and it was right here in the bond between a father and his son. The road to recovery, healing together, the weeks following the wedding that never was felt like waking up from a long, disorienting dream. The echoes of betrayal still lingered in the air, but for David and Ethan, the most difficult part wasn't just processing what had happened, it was figuring out how to move forward. The pain of nearly being deceived, of trusting someone who had planned to destroy their lives, weighed heavily on them both. But even in the midst of that pain, there was something stronger, the unspoken promise that they would heal together one day at a time. For David, the hardest part was reconciling the guilt he carried. No matter how many times people told him that Grace had been a master manipulator, that even the smartest and strongest men could fall for someone like her, it didn't erase the deep ache in his chest. He had been blind. He had let his own desire for love and companionship cloud his judgment. And worst of all, he had failed to protect Ethan from her cruelty. That knowledge haunted him, especially in the quiet moments when Ethan wasn't looking. At night, after putting his son to bed, he would sit alone in the dim glow of the living room, replaying the past months over and over, wondering how he hadn't seen the signs. But there was no undoing the past. There was only the future, and David was determined to make sure Ethan's future felt safe again. The first step, he realized, was not pretending everything was fine. He didn't want to sweep this under the rug or act like it had never happened. So, one evening after dinner, he sat Ethan down on the couch, their 2 plates of half-eaten pizza resting on the coffee table. "Buddy," David began, his voice softer than usual, "I want to talk about everything that happened. Not just about Grace, but about how you're feeling, about how we move forward." Ethan, who had been carefully picking at the crust of his pizza, looked up hesitantly. "Okay," he said, his voice small. David took a breath. "I know this has been a lot for you, and I know that for a long time you were carrying all of this by yourself. That's not fair. You shouldn't have had to do that." Ethan was quiet for a moment before he finally admitted, "I didn't know how to make you believe me." David felt his chest tighten. He reached for Ethan's hand, squeezing it gently. "That's my fault," he said, "and I don't ever want you to feel like you can't talk to me again. No matter what it is, big or small, I will listen. I promise." Ethan nodded, and for the first time in weeks, his shoulders seemed to relax, just a little. "I don't want to think about her anymore," he admitted, "but sometimes I do." David understood. Trauma didn't just disappear because you wanted it to. "That's normal," he reassured him. "But you don't have to go through it alone." That was the moment David decided they needed real help. He had always believed in being strong for his son, but strength, he realized, wasn't about pretending to have all the answers. It was about knowing when to ask for help, so together they started seeing a therapista place where Ethan could talk about his fears and David could confront his own guilt. At first, Ethan had been hesitant. "What if I don't know what to say?" he had asked nervously before their first session. David had smiled at him and said, "Then we sit in the silence together until you do." Therapy wasn't an instant fix, but over time it gave them both the tools to process what had happened in a healthy way. For Ethan, it meant understanding that what he had been through wasn't his fault, that Grace's cruelty and deception weren't a reflection of anything he had done. For David, it meant learning to forgive himself, to recognize that being tricked didn't make him weak, it made him human. But healing wasn't just about therapy. It was about filling their days with things that made them feel whole again. David started making small changes, things that reminded Ethan of the safety and stability of their little world. He started leaving work a little earlier so they could cook dinner together, even if most nights ended with a ridiculous amount of spaghetti sauce on the floor. They took weekend trips to places they had never been before, replacing old memories with new ones. They even started a tradition every Friday night, no matter what, was movie night. The rules were simple, popcorn was mandatory, and Ethan got to pick the movie, even if it meant sitting through the Lego movie for the 100th time. One Saturday afternoon, a few months after the wedding, David found Ethan sitting in the backyard, lost in thought. He stepped outside, settling onto the porch steps beside him. "What's on your mind?" he asked. Ethan hesitated, then said, "Do you think I'll ever forget about her?" David thought about that for a long moment before shaking his head. "Probably not," he admitted. "But I don't think forgetting is the point." Ethan frowned. "Then what is?" David rested a hand on his son's shoulder. "The point is learning how to move forward without letting the past control you. It's okay if you think about her sometimes. It's okay if it makes you sad or mad or anything in between. But what matters is that you don't let it define you." Ethan was quiet, processing his father's words. Then, after a moment, he leaned his head against David's shoulder. "I don't feel as scared anymore," he murmured. David felt a lump rise in his throat. That's because you're the bravest kid I know. The months turned into a year, and life kept moving forward. The fear that had once shadowed Ethan's eyes faded, replaced with the bright curiosity that had always defined him. David too felt lighter. The weight of regret, of what-ifs, no longer consumed him. He had made mistakes, but he had also learned from them. And most importantly, he and Ethan had come out of it together stronger, closer. One day, while cleaning out an old drawer, David came across a framed photo of him and Ethan from years ago, back when Ethan had just turned 5. In the picture, Ethan was sitting on his shoulders, laughing as David pretended to stumble under his weight. It was a picture taken long before Grace had entered their lives, before any of the pain that followed. And as David looked at it, he realized something: this was always who they were, just a father and his son figuring it out together. That evening, as they sat down for their usual Friday movie night, David nudged Ethan playfully. "You know," he said, "we've been through a lot." Ethan grinned. "Yeah, but we're still here." David smiled, wrapping an arm around his son. "Yeah, buddy, we are." And in that moment, he knew they had healed, not because they had forgotten, but because they had faced it together. Because love, real love, wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about standing side by side, through the worst of it, and choosing to keep going. And they had. They always would. A new chapter. Finding strength in each other. The days that followed the chaos of the wedding were filled with uncertainty. The air around David and Ethan was heavy with the weight of the past, but beneath the silence, there was a growing sense of possibility. In the aftermath of everything that had transpired, the two of them found themselves standing at the crossroads of a new chapter. The road behind them was fraught with heartbreak, betrayal, and the painful knowledge that someone they had trusted had turned out to be a stranger, someone with ulterior motives. But the road ahead, while unclear and filled with its own set of challenges, carried the promise of hailing a future that, for the first time in a long while, felt hopeful. David had always been the protector, the one who kept Ethan safe, who shielded him from harm. But the events of the past months had shattered that sense of control. David had been vulnerable, deceived, and in many ways, it had felt like everything he thought he understood about his life had been turned upside down. He had thought he had found the woman who would share his life, someone who could be a mother to Ethan, but instead, he had invited darkness into their home. And for a while, it seemed as though nothing would ever be the same again. But as time passed, David started to see something that changed everything. He started to realize that, despite the damage caused, he and Ethan still had each other. They had always been a team, but now, in the face of adversity, that bond was more apparent than ever. What had once felt like an insurmountable burden to David, the guilt, the shame, the deep regret began to lift, not because the past could be undone, but because he had something more powerful than he had ever known: the unbreakable love and loyalty of his son. Ethan too had changed. The boy who had once been forced to carry a secret too heavy for his young shoulders was now finding solace in the very thing he had feared losing: this connection with his father. In the wake of his courage to speak the truth, to reveal the secrets he had overheard, Ethan had grown stronger. He had become more attuned to his own emotions, more willing to trust his instinct. And most importantly, he had seen that his father, the man he had looked up to, was human flawed, yes, but still capable of incredible strength. In that strength, Ethan saw hope. He saw the possibility of a future where they could rebuild their lives together, stronger than before. As the months passed, David and Ethan took small steps towards healing. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the weight of their shared experience would press down on them, moments when the sting of betrayal would flare up again. But through it all, they leaned on each other. They leaned on the comfort of knowing that, no matter what, they had one another. David began to prioritize Ethan in ways he never had before. His work, his past relationships, his ambitions, none of it mattered as much as his son did. Every day, he found new ways to show Ethan how much he meant to him. He started taking weekends off, making time to teach Ethan things that had always seemed too trivial in the past: how to fish, how to tie a proper knot, how to ride a bike without training wheels. These small acts, seemingly insignificant to the outside world, became the foundation for a relationship that was stronger than anything they had ever experienced. Ethan, in turn, began to open up more. He wasn't the same boy who had been so fearful of disappointing his father. He wasn't the same child who had kept his feelings bottled up, too afraid to speak the truth. With each passing day, he felt more secure in the love he shared with David. They talked about their feelings now without fear or hesitation. The walls that had once stood between them, built by secrets and misunderstandings, slowly crumbled, replaced by a bond that was built on trust, vulnerability, and shared experience. But healing didn't just happen between the two of them. It became a collective effort to redefine what family meant. The relationships that had been strained or broken were slowly being rebuilt. David reached out to his friends, those who had stood by him, even when things were difficult, and made amends where he could. He reconnected with old acquaintances, recognizing the importance of a support system, something he had neglected in the chaos of his relationship with Grace. He learned that a strong family wasn't just built on blood, but on the people who genuinely cared and had his back no matter what. Ethan, too, started to rebuild his own world. He found new friends at school, people who listened to him, people who didn't judge him for his past. He joined activities that allowed him to express himself, like a local art class where he could let his emotions flow through paint and canvas. He discovered that there was more to him than just the boy who had faced hardship. He was also a boy full of creativity, full of potential. As he began to flourish, David couldn't help but be amazed by how far Ethan had come. He was no longer just the boy who had suffered in silence. He was becoming the young man who had found strength in the face of adversity. There were still difficult days, of course. There were moments when the memories of Grace's manipulation would resurface, when doubts would creep in. But the difference now was that David and Ethan had each other to turn to. They were no longer facing the world alone, and that made all the difference. As the years passed, the story of Grace, the woman who had almost torn their lives apart, became just that, a story. It was a chapter in their history, but it was no longer the defining feature of their lives. The pain that had once been so raw and real was now a distant memory, replaced by laughter of shared moments, the comfort of knowing they were enough just as they were. David found love again, in his own time and on his own terms. He didn't rush into another relationship. He took things slow, focusing first on being the best father he could be. And when he eventually did find someone special, he made sure that she understood the importance of his relationship with Ethan, and that Ethan was always his first priority. It wasn't about replacing Grace. It was about building a future that honored the love and trust he shared with his son. For Ethan, life became a series of small victories. He excelled in school, he made lasting friendships, and he grew into a young man who had learned the true meaning of strength, not from avoiding pain, but from enduring it and using it to fuel his growth. His relationship with David remained as solid as ever, and as he got older, he came to realize that the love between them wasn't just a given, it was something they had fought for, something they had earned through the hardest of times. Together, they built a new life, a life where the past no longer had control over them, where love was the foundation for everything they did. They learned that healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And as they walked that journey side by side, they discovered that they were not only stronger than they had ever been, but they were also ready for whatever came next. With each other, they could face anything. And that, David realized, was the greatest gift of all, the power of one voice. A lesson in courage and integrity. The power of a single voice can often be underestimated. Yet, throughout history, it has been the catalyst for transformation, the spark that ignites a revolution, and the lifeline that saves lives. In a world where the noise of many can sometimes drown out the quiet whispers of the individual, it is easy to forget that one person, armed with courage and integrity, can change the course of events in ways that ripple through the lives of others. The story of Ethan, a young boy who unearthed a dangerous secret and revealed it at the most pivotal moment, is a testament to this truth, the transformative power of one voice, driven by the courage to speak the truth, even when the world around them might not believe it. Ethan was just 8 years old when he found himself thrust into a situation far beyond his years. His father, David, was about to marry a woman named Emily, who on the surface seemed perfect. Yet beneath her carefully constructed facade, a darker truth was lurking. Ethan knew something wasn't right. He had seen the way Emily treated him when his father wasn't around, cold, dismissive, even cruel. He had overheard her conversations, snippets of which painted a picture that filled him with dread. Emily's intentions toward his father were far from pure. In those moments, the small voice of Ethan, a child with the heart of a lion, became the one thing that could stand between a tragic fate and a happy ending. The courage it took for Ethan to speak out was nothing short of extraordinary. Most children in his situation would have kept quiet, too afraid of the consequences, too unsure of their own ability to make a difference. But not Ethan. His sense of right and wrong was as clear as day. He knew that his father was in danger, and he would not remain silent. In the face of a room full of wedding guests, In front of the woman who would soon be his stepmother, he stood up and shouted those life-altering words, "Stop the wedding." What followed was chaos. A wave of disbelief and confusion crashed over the ceremony, but Ethan's words rang clear. As he stood there, trembling but resolute, he did what so many people often fail to do, trusted his instincts. He listened to the voice inside him that screamed for justice, for the truth to come to light. It didn't matter how young he was, it didn't matter how ridiculous or impossible it seemed to everyone else. In that moment, Ethan knew that his voice was the only thing that could stop the devastating plan that was set in motion. Ethan's bravery wasn't rooted in the absence of fear. It was the very presence of fear, the overwhelming knowledge of what could happen if he did not speak up, that gave him the strength to act. He was afraid of ruining his father's happiness, of being misunderstood, of having no one believe him. But he was even more afraid of letting something happen to his dad, of allowing the woman his father trusted to deceive them both. That fear gave way to a deep-seated courage, the kind of courage that only comes when you realize the cost of silence is far greater than the price of standing up for what is right. In the moments following Ethan's outburst, the air was thick with tension. The entire room seemed to freeze in time, unsure of how to respond. But Ethan didn't need validation from anyone. He had already validated himself by speaking the truth, no matter the consequences. In that moment, his voice became an undeniable force, louder than the murmurs of the crowd, stronger than the deflections of the woman whose life of deceit was now exposed. David's reaction was one of immediate shock, but there was something more profound that Ethan saw in his father's eyes. It was the pain of betrayal, the heartbreak of realizing that someone he had loved and trusted had been lying to him. Ethan's revelation, though painful, was the only thing that could free David from the web of deceit he had been unknowingly caught in. And in that instant, as David looked at Ethan, something began to shift inside him. His trust in his son, the bond they had shared, became his anchor, guiding him through the emotional turmoil that followed. The aftermath of Ethan's revelation was not just about the immediate shock and chaos of the wedding. It was about the emotional journey that both he and his father had to take in the days and weeks that followed. For David, it was the painful realization that he had been blind to the truth for so long. He had been so wrapped up in his own happiness that he had failed to see the warning signs, the small cracks in the facade that his fiancée had so carefully constructed. But with Ethan's courage to speak the truth, David was given a second chance and opportunity to reevaluate the life he had been building and to make the right decisions moving forward. For Ethan, the aftermath was equally difficult. He had exposed the truth, but in doing so, he had placed a burden on his small shoulders. The burden of knowing that his father's world would be turned upside down. The burden of being the one who had to bear witness to the fallout from his revelation. He had acted from a place of love, of deep concern for his father's well-being, but the emotional toll it took on him was not to be underestimated. At such a young age, he had been forced to shoulder the responsibility of safeguarding his family, of standing up for what was right in a world that often fails to recognize the importance of doing so. Through the pain and uncertainty, one thing remained clear. Ethan had acted from a place of integrity, and his voice, though small, had made a difference. It had stopped a wedding, uncovered a web of lies, and, in the process, it had saved his father's life. But more than that, it had served as a powerful reminder of the impact one voice can have when it is grounded in courage and honesty. Ethan's voice was not one of anger or revenge. It was the voice of a child who simply could not allow injustice to stand. And that voice, when combined with the unshakable love between father and son, proved to be the most powerful force in the room. In the days that followed, as David and Ethan navigated the aftermath of their experience, they began to rebuild. Their relationship was forever changed, but in a way that was deeply meaningful. David realized that his love for his son was unconditional, and he vowed to never again let his own desires blind him to the truth. Ethan, meanwhile, learned the true strength of his own voice, and the immense responsibility that comes with using it for good. Together, they found healing, but they also found something even more profound, the realization that their bond was stronger than anything that could come between them. In the end, Ethan's story serves as a poignant reminder to all of us of the power of one voice. One voice, when spoken with courage and integrity, can reveal truths that others are too afraid to face. One voice can change lives, shatter illusions, and reshape the future. And perhaps most importantly, one voice can remind us all that no matter how young or small we may be, we all have the power to make a difference. The lesson of Ethan's bravery, His willingness to speak out in the face of fear teaches us that integrity and courage are not only virtues to be admired, they are the tools that can shape the world around us. And sometimes it is the quietest voices that speak the loudest. Ethan's story is a powerful reminder of the impact one voice can have. In a world that often values silence or conformity, his unwavering courage in speaking the truth disrupted not just a wedding, but the course of his father's life. The lesson here is clear. Integrity and bravery do not have an age limit. Even a child, when armed with honesty and love, can change the lives of those around them. Ethan's actions emphasize the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter the consequences or how challenging the truth might be. His story encourages us to trust our instincts, to never shy away from difficult truths, and to have the courage to face uncomfortable situations head-on. In the end, this is not just a tale about a son saving his father, it's a lesson in the strength of the human spirit. It shows us that love, when rooted in honesty and courage, can overcome deceit and fear. The courage to speak out, no matter how small or insignificant we might feel, can create waves of change that resonate far beyond our own lives. Ethan's voice reminds us all that sometimes the smallest actions can have the most profound impact. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more exciting stories. See you next time.